Today, we delve into an extraordinary story, an intellectual debate that shook minds, opened eyes, and affirmed the timeless words of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It unfolded on the grand stage of one of Europe's most prestigious universities, where two remarkable figures, each from vastly different backgrounds, came face to face. On one side stood Michael Dayan, a 45-year-old former Christian academic and theologian. After a long, personal journey in pursuit of truth, he ultimately embraced Islam. On the opposite side was Dr. Richard Coleman, a 58-year-old religious leader widely recognized in the West for his theological expertise. Renowned in interfaith circles, Dr. Coleman had spent decades in religious dialogue and debate. But this wasn't just another academic exchange. This was a stage where the truth would be tested, where arguments would clash, and where history might be made. That evening, the university's large hall was filled to capacity. Academics, students, and religious figures from various backgrounds filled every seat. The air was thick with anticipation, as everyone knew they were about to witness an unforgettable debate between two intellectual giants. Michael sat calmly, his expression reflecting the resolve of someone who had traveled a long, difficult road in pursuit of answers. Once deeply rooted in the Christian theological tradition, Michael had found himself increasingly burdened by questions that his former faith could never fully answer. Years of study eventually led him to Islam. Dr. Richard Coleman, on the other hand, entered the hall with confidence. A veteran of countless debates and lectures, he regarded this event as just another discussion. He was certain his knowledge and arguments would easily dismantle Michael's new beliefs. As the moderator stepped up and opened the event, the room fell into a respectful silence. All eyes were on the stage. Brothers and sisters, the moderator began. Today, we witness a rare and important discussion. Before us are two esteemed speakers. On one side is Dr. Richard Coleman, a leading European theologian who has devoted his life to the study of religion. On the other is Michael Dayan, an academic who embraced Islam after an extensive personal journey for truth. Tonight, we explore a profound question. Are the words of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, true? Does Islam present an undeniable truth? Michael offered a small, polite smile as he glanced at Dr. Coleman, who returned a confident look. The moderator then handed Michael the microphone to begin. Before I begin, Michael said in a calm but steady voice, I'd like to ask Dr. Richard a simple question. It may sound ordinary, but I believe it's essential to our understanding of truth. Dr. Richard nodded slightly, attentive. Do you believe that the real truth should not contradict common sense or scientific evidence? Of course, Dr. Richard replied. As an academic and a religious leader, I believe truth must align with reason and evidence. Michael smiled faintly. Then let's begin there. He reached into his bag and retrieved a small book, a translation of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which he had discovered during his spiritual search before embracing Islam. In one hadith, Michael continued, the Prophet Muhammad said, Indeed, in the body there is a piece of flesh. If it is sound, the whole body is sound. And if it is corrupt, the whole body is corrupt. Indeed, it is the heart. The room grew quiet. Some attendees appeared thoughtful, others whispered to each other. Dr. Richard leaned forward slightly intrigued. Michael went on. Doctor, can I ask, how many centuries ago did modern medicine discover that the heart plays a role beyond just pumping blood? That it's connected to our psychological, emotional, and even mental states? Dr. Richard looked caught off guard. He knew that only in recent decades had science begun to uncover the heart's deeper connection to human emotion and mental well-being. I came across this hadith while I was still a Christian, Michael explained. At first, I assumed it was metaphorical. But the more I studied it, the more I realized this statement, made over 1,400 years ago, revealed a truth modern science is only now beginning to confirm. The tension in the room rose. Dr. Richard finally responded. But Michael, couldn't that just be a coincidence? Many ancient sayings can be interpreted in different ways. Michael gently shook his head. All right. Let's go further. He leaned forward and spoke with quiet intensity. The Prophet Muhammad also described a phenomenon in the ocean, that there is a barrier between fresh water and salt water, and that they do not mix. Doctor, can you tell us when science confirmed this? Dr. Richard hesitated. He knew the answer. This scientific fact, relating to the halocline barrier in oceanography, was only fully understood in modern times. Michael leaned back, his voice steady. If we are truly seeking belief grounded in evidence, then we must ask, how could an unlettered man in the 7th century describe such scientific truths, centuries before they were discovered? Where did this knowledge come from? The room was completely still. Dr. Richard sat in silence, seemingly deep in thought. But before he could formulate a response, the moderator stepped in. We'll continue this discussion after a short break, he announced. Michael's question is thought-provoking and deserves careful reflection. Let's take this moment to consider whether it can be substantiated or refuted. The audience began to murmur. Some looked stunned. Others exchanged glances of disbelief at the facts Michael had presented. Yet Michael remained seated, composed, and patient, waiting for the conversation to resume. He knew the debate had only just begun. After the break, the moderator returned to the podium, his expression noticeably more serious. It was clear that he now understood this wasn't a routine theological debate, it was something deeper. A moment of truth. A test of reason. Michael sat still, his demeanor calm and unwavering. In contrast, Dr. Richard appeared slightly uneasy. Perhaps not because he lacked knowledge, but because he realized he wasn't facing mere emotion or blind belief. He was facing logic, evidence, and profound understanding from someone many might underestimate as a new convert. Let's return to the discussion, the moderator said. Dr. Richard, you now have the opportunity to respond to Michael Dayan's earlier arguments. What is your perspective? Dr. Richard took a deep breath. He began in a firm, confident tone. Michael, I must admit, some of what you've shared is intriguing. I won't deny that certain aspects of Islamic teachings appear to align with modern scientific discoveries. However, I'd like to remind everyone that not everything that seems scientifically accurate in religious texts can be taken as absolute proof. Michael nodded quietly, allowing his opponent to continue uninterrupted. Many ancient civilizations, Dr. Richard went on, had theories about the world. And yes, some of them happen to coincide with modern science. But does that mean all their ideas were divinely inspired? Take the Greeks, for instance. They had insights into anatomy and astronomy. Yet we don't consider their writings to be divine revelation. The room fell silent again, everyone waiting for Michael's response. He smiled gently, then looked straight at Dr. Richard. Doctor, I deeply respect your point. But there's a fundamental difference between general ancient wisdom and the precise words of a prophet, he said. If we assume that some knowledge comes from observation, let me ask you, how could an illiterate man, living in the deserts of Arabia, possibly have access to knowledge about marine science or embryology? Dr. Richard's eyes widened slightly. Michael continued, still calm but with unmistakable conviction. Let's talk about embryology. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, described the development of a human being in the womb in several stages. He said that the human starts as a clot, then becomes a lump of flesh, and eventually takes form. This aligns with what modern science has only confirmed in the 20th century, through ultrasound technology and medical research. How could a man in the 7th century describe these stages so precisely? The audience stirred again. Some leaned forward in curiosity. A few medical students in the front row exchanged glances and nodded. They understood the accuracy of what had just been said. Dr. Richard paused before responding. I won't deny that it's interesting, he said. But are you aware that some ancient civilizations, like those in India and Greece, also had concepts of fetal development? Michael nodded. Of course, Doctor. But there's a key difference. Their theories were mixed with myths and inaccuracies. Take Aristotle, for example. He believed the fetus formed from menstrual blood combined with male sperm. That's clearly incorrect. But in Islam, the stages of development revealed are specific and accurate. There is no contradiction. No error. Dr. Richard took a deep breath, visibly searching for a new angle. Then he said, "But Islam can't be judged solely by how it aligns with science. A religion must also be evaluated by its teachings as a whole. And we know there are aspects of Islam that conflict with Western values." Michael smiled. "I know where this is going, Doctor," Michael said, his gaze steady. "You're about to bring up Islamic law, aren't you? The kind that many people think is harsh." Dr. Richard nodded. "Yes. How can a religion that claims to be based on truth and compassion allow punishments like amputating the hands of thieves or flogging adulterers? Isn't that contrary to the principle of mercy?" Michael looked him square in the eye. "I'll answer that. But first, let me ask you something, Doctor. Do you believe that law should have a deterrent effect?" "Of course," Dr. Richard replied. "Then tell me, if a country is experiencing a surge in crime, is the solution to weaken the laws, or to make them stronger?" Dr. Richard hesitated. Michael pressed on. "I understand that many in the West see Islamic law as severe. But let's look at the results. Did you know that some of the countries with the lowest crime rates in the world are the ones that strictly implement Islamic law?" A student in the front row raised his hand. "Yes," he said. "I read reports that theft rates in Saudi Arabia are significantly lower than in many Western countries." Michael smiled. "Thank you for that. And I'd like to clarify something further. Islamic law isn't about immediate punishment. In the case of theft, for example, Islam doesn't just cut off someone's hand without context. There are strict conditions. If a person steals out of hunger or poverty, the punishment is not applied. If the stolen item is of insignificant value, again, the hand is not cut off. Islamic law isn't only about punishment, it's about prevention, justice, and balance." Dr. Richard didn't reply. He seemed to be searching for a counterpoint, but his silence said enough. Meanwhile, many in the audience leaned in with growing interest. Michael turned back to Dr. Richard. "Now let me ask you something. If Islam is a religion of violence, as it is often portrayed in the media, why are conversion rates increasing, especially in Western countries?" Dr. Richard was silent. He seemed to be deep in thought. Just then, a woman from the middle row raised her hand. She introduced herself as a professor of religious history. "I think that's a very important question," she said. "I've spent years researching this, and I've found that one of the primary reasons people convert to Islam is because they see the beauty of its teachings, something quite different from what the media shows." Michael turned to her with a smile. "Thank you, Professor. That's exactly what happened to me. I was a devoted Christian academic. I studied the Qur'an not to convert, but to find faults. Yet the more I read, the more I discovered that every question I had, questions that no other religion could answer, were answered in Islam." The room was still. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone was locked in, captivated by the unfolding dialogue. Finally, Dr. Richard spoke again. "I respect your decision, Michael. But I still believe that truth cannot be judged solely by how it aligns with science or logic." Michael nodded. "Of course, Doctor. And I also believe that real truth should resonate with a sincere and honest heart." The moderator then stepped forward again. "I think we've arrived at a very significant point in this discussion," he said. "But the debate is far from over. In the next session, we'll address perhaps the biggest question of all. If Islam is true, what does that mean for the world?" A curious sigh rippled through the hall. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. This wasn't just an academic discussion anymore. It had become a deep, intellectual confrontation, one that challenged long-held beliefs and demanded personal reflection. Some audience members leaned toward their neighbors, whispering quietly. Others sat in stunned silence, absorbing every word. What had started as a scholarly exchange was quickly becoming something much more profound. Dr. Richard took a sip of water, trying to gather his thoughts. His eyes now carried a sharper intensity. He understood. He could no longer rely on rhetoric. He had to face Michael with substance. Michael looked at him and said, "Doctor, I appreciate the depth of this conversation. You've raised important points. But let me ask you one final question, one that many skeptics often ask." Dr. Richard leaned in slightly, listening. "If Islam is the true religion," Michael asked, "then why are so many Muslim-majority countries lagging behind in science, technology, and economic development?" Michael smiled softly, anticipating the question. "That's a very good question, Doctor," he said. "And I'll answer it honestly. But before I do, let me ask you this. Do you agree there's a big difference between the teachings of a religion and how its followers actually practice it?" Dr. Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, I agree. Not everyone who claims to follow a religion always reflects its teachings properly." "Exactly," Michael said. "Now let's look at the facts. You mentioned that many Muslim-majority countries are lagging behind in science and economics. That's true, I don't deny it. But the real question is that because of Islam, or because of other, more complex factors?" Once again, the room fell silent. All eyes were on Michael. "Let's turn to history," he continued. "From the 8th to the 14th century, the Islamic world was the center of scientific progress. Muslim scholars like Ibn Sina, al-Farabi, and al-Khwarizmi made groundbreaking contributions in medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and more. The very concept of algebra was pioneered by a Muslim scientist. The first universities in the world were established in the Islamic world, long before Europe had formal systems of higher education." He paused for a moment, allowing the audience to process the weight of what he was saying. "So if Islam were the cause of decline, how do we explain the fact that during the golden age of Islam, the Muslim world led in knowledge, science, and innovation?" Several members of the audience began nodding. Others sat in thought, their expressions contemplative. "But then came colonialism, war, and decades of political corruption," Michael said. "These events derailed progress in many Muslim nations. And none of that was caused by Islam. It was the result of external oppression and internal mismanagement." Dr. Richard leaned forward slightly. "So you're saying it's not Islam, but the political and social conditions in those countries that caused the decline?" "Exactly," Michael replied. "If Islam was the cause of backwardness, then how do you explain the success of Muslims in the West? In the United States, Muslims have one of the highest average levels of education. In the UK, Muslims are among the most active entrepreneurs. These facts show that when Islam is practiced in a supportive and just environment, the results are outstanding." A student raised his hand. "So, do you think if Muslim countries properly implemented Islam, they could become great again?" Michael smiled. "Yes, I do. I believe that if Islam is practiced in its true spirit, with a focus on knowledge, justice, and compassion, the Islamic world can once again become a center of civilization. But for that to happen, there must be reform, in mindset, in governance, and in priorities." Dr. Richard exhaled. "All right. I see your point. But there's one more thing I need to ask. If Islam is true, why is there so much conflict within the Muslim world? Sunni and Shia tensions, for example. If Islam is the religion of truth, why are its followers fighting each other?" Michael's face remained calm. "Doctor, is there any religion in the world completely free from internal division?" Dr. Richard said nothing. "Christianity itself has countless denominations," Michael continued. "And many of them have even fought wars against each other. The Catholic-Protestant conflict in Europe lasted for centuries. Judaism also has major internal divisions in belief and interpretation. Even in secular ideologies, communism, capitalism, socialism, there are major disagreements, sometimes even violent ones. A history professor in the audience nodded. That's true, she said. Many wars throughout history were not purely religious, but were fueled by political and power struggles. Michael nodded. Exactly. Conflict doesn't prove that a religion is false. It only proves that human beings have differing views, and often, political ambition gets mixed in with religion. That's a human issue, not a flaw in the religion itself. Dr. Richard sat back in his chair, clearly deep in thought. He knew he wasn't dealing with emotional fanaticism. Michael was presenting reasoned, articulate, and well-informed arguments. Doctor, Michael said gently, you are a rational academic. If all this evidence is laid out before you, scientific consistency, historical accuracy, logical teachings, would you still reject the possibility that Islam could be the truth? The room held its breath. Dr. Richard didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he said, Michael, I'll be honest. I don't have a strong enough answer to refute everything you've said. But accepting Islam is not just a matter of logic. It's also a matter of faith. Of the heart. And I'm not ready for that. Not yet. Michael smiled warmly. I understand, Doctor. Truly. It took me a long time, too. But I hope you'll keep searching and reflecting. The room felt completely silent. The atmosphere was no longer that of a debate. It was a moment of deep introspection. Then, unexpectedly, a student stood up. I'd like to say something, he said. I came here tonight as a skeptic. But after hearing all this, I feel like there's something different about Islam. I want to learn more. A few others nodded in agreement. Some appeared visibly emotional, their eyes glistening. Dr. Richard looked over at Michael and sighed. I think I'll look deeper too, he said quietly. This is the first time I've felt that I don't have a strong enough answer to push something away. The moderator stepped forward again, his voice soft but firm. I think we've reached a deeply important point in this conversation. But we're not finished yet. There is still one final question we must explore. If Islam is true, how should the world respond to it? The tension in the room rose again, this time not with conflict, but with curiosity. Something was shifting. This wasn't just a debate, it was the beginning of a profound internal journey for many present. Just as the moderator was about to continue, a man from the front row raised his hand. His expression was serious, his presence commanding. He looked to be in his mid-50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that held both wisdom and intensity. From his posture and demeanor, he appeared to be an academic, or perhaps a religious leader. Excuse me, he said in a calm but firm voice. The moderator nodded, inviting him to speak. My name is Pastor James W. Moore, he said. I've devoted my life to the study of religion. And I must say, I'm surprised by the direction this discussion has taken. But there's one question that still lingers in my mind. He turned to Michael with a piercing gaze. You've spoken at length about Islam as the true religion. But what about salvation? In Christian belief, salvation comes only through Jesus Christ. If Islam is the truth, how do you explain salvation? The question landed like a stone in still water, clear, direct, and powerful. The entire room stilled again. Michael nodded, almost as if he had been waiting for this very moment. Pastor James, he said, that is a very profound question, and I want to answer it as clearly as I can. But first, may I ask you something in return? Pastor James nodded. Go ahead. Do you believe that God, Allah, is just? Of course, the pastor replied. Michael leaned forward slightly. Then let me ask, If God is truly just, does it make sense for him to offer salvation only to a small group of people who happen to be born in a certain time, in a certain place, and who heard a specific message? Pastor James paused. He understood where this was going. In Islam, Michael continued, salvation is not reserved for one race, one nation, or one moment in history. Islam teaches that every human being is accountable for their own actions. Michael continued, God does not burden one soul with the sins of another. In Islam, each person is judged based on their intentions, their efforts, and their sincerity in seeking the truth. Allah does not oppress those who are genuinely searching for guidance. Pastor James exhaled slowly. So, you're saying that salvation comes from belief in Allah and sincere deeds, not solely from faith in one particular figure? Michael nodded. That's correct. Islam does not reject Jesus, known in Islam as Prophet Isa, peace be upon him. But we do not believe that salvation is found only through him. We believe that all prophets, from Adam to Muhammad, peace be upon them all, were sent with the same message: worship one God, live justly, and do good. Once again, the room fell into silence. Some looked shocked. Others seemed deeply moved, reflecting silently on Michael's words. Pastor James finally spoke. I can't deny that your reasoning makes sense. But there's still one question I must ask. If Islam is the truth, then why has Allah allowed so many different religions to exist? Why didn't He make everyone accept Islam from the beginning? Michael smiled gently. That's a profound question, Pastor. And the answer lies in the Qur'an itself. God says that if He had willed, He could have made all of humanity one single community. But He gave us the freedom to think, to reflect, and to choose. This life is a test. And each person is given the opportunity to seek the truth. Pastor James nodded slowly, though the question still lingered in his heart. So, do you believe Islam is the ultimate answer to that search for truth? Michael sighed, his voice soft but certain. I don't believe in forcing anyone to accept anything. But I do believe that if someone truly seeks the truth with an open heart, they will eventually be led to Islam. Because Islam is not just a religion, it's a complete way of life. It guides every aspect of a person's existence, from personal ethics to societal justice. Suddenly, a student in the back stood up. His voice trembled with emotion. I was raised in a Christian family, he said. But for years I felt something was missing. After listening to this debate, I feel like I've started to find what I've been searching for. Whispers spread across the room. What had begun as an academic exchange was now transforming into something deeply spiritual, life-changing. Dr. Richard, who had been silently observing the exchange between Michael and Pastor James, now leaned forward. Michael, he said, I have one last question. If Islam is truly the truth, how can we be sure that the Qur'an is from God, and not simply the writing of a man? Michael smiled. Doctor, I've been waiting for that question. The room grew still again. Everyone's attention turned to Michael. This was the question that could decide everything. Michael stepped forward and spoke with calm clarity. Let's begin with the purity of the Qur'an. For over 1,400 years, not a single letter of it has changed. There has never been a revised edition, no updates, no alterations. This is not a claim, it is a historical fact. You can verify it through academic and textual research. Heads nodded throughout the room. Now let's examine it from a scientific perspective. Michael continued. The Qur'an, revealed in the 7th century, contains numerous facts that modern science has only recently confirmed. One example is the description of embryological development. The Qur'an mentions that humans are created from a clinging clot inside the womb. Today, we know that in the early stages of pregnancy, the embryo does appear like a clot of blood attached to the wall of the uterus. Dr. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Michael smiled gently. And finally, The most powerful proof is the way the Qur'an changes hearts. I am proof of that. I was once skeptical. I doubted everything. But when I read the Qur'an with an open heart, I found a truth I could no longer deny. These aren't just poetic verses. They are a divine message, a guide for life. The room was utterly silent. Even Pastor James sat in deep thought. Dr. Richard took a deep breath. I must admit, your argument is strong. I won't say I believe everything, but I do see something different in how you speak about Islam. Something that feels real. Michael nodded with a warm smile. Doctor, Islam doesn't force anyone to believe. It simply invites every human being to think, to reflect, and to search with sincerity. All I ask is that you read the Qur'an yourself, without bias. Let your heart and mind decide. Dr. Richard nodded firmly. I promise I will read it, starting tonight. Applause broke out in the room. Some smiled. Others were visibly emotional. The student who had spoken earlier stood again. I want to learn more about Islam, he said. Michael's face lit up with a kind expression. Of course. Just remember, seeking the truth is a journey. Don't rush. Keep your heart sincere and your mind open. Pastor James looked at Michael, eyes filled with a mix of amazement and uncertainty. I never imagined this discussion would lead me to so many questions I now have to explore. Michael nodded. We're all on a journey, Pastor. And that journey often begins when we dare to question what we've always believed. Dr. Richard looked at Michael one last time. Thank you, Michael. I may not fully agree with you today, but I respect you deeply. And for the first time, I want to learn more. Michael smiled gently. And with that, the debate came to an end, but the discussion was far from over. Many hearts in the room had been opened. Many minds were now wrestling with truths they had long ignored. The journey to discovering truth is rarely instant. Sometimes, we must question everything we've ever believed. We must open our hearts to new knowledge and pursue understanding with sincerity. Islam doesn't force, it invites. It guides those who truly want to be guided. Everyone has their own path. Some reach it quickly. Others take years. But as long as the heart remains open, there is always hope to find the light. And perhaps, just like Michael, there are countless souls still searching for answers hidden within their own hearts. This is not just a story, it is a reflection of real journeys happening around the world. If this touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people may benefit from it. Thank you for watching. Peace and blessings be upon you all. This is the remarkable story of how an arrogant atheist professor boldly challenged Islam in a public seminar, and even threatened to burn the Qur'an, until a 5-year-old Muslim boy stepped forward and debated her. At first, the crowd laughed at him. But one simple, innocent question from the child left the professor speechless, and forced her to walk away in embarrassment. Let's dive into this powerful story, and for those watching, may your journey be blessed and your path made smooth. It was a packed day at Oxford University. Thousands of students and scholars from around the world had gathered in one of the grand halls. Every seat was taken, and the remaining audience members stood clustered at the back, all eager to witness what was being called the most controversial seminar of the year. On stage stood Professor Elizabeth, a tall, elderly woman with snow-white hair, neatly combed back. Her black suit radiated authority. With piercing eyes that scanned the crowd like a hawk, she surveyed the room filled with anticipation and a subtle hint of tension. Today, once again, she was preparing to launch a verbal assault against religion, particularly Islam. With slow, confident steps, Elizabeth approached the table at the center of the stage. A copy of the Qur'an rested on a podium, placed as though it were an accused object awaiting trial. She stared at the holy book with open contempt before turning to face the audience, her expression cold and full of pride. "We live in an age of science," she declared loudly. "Human reason alone should guide us toward the truth." Her voice echoed through the auditorium. "And yet, something ancient still haunts our civilization, religion. And of all the religions mankind has clung to, Islam is the most dangerous." The room fell into stunned silence. Students exchanged looks. A few whispered nervously. Others shook their heads. But no one dared speak up. Elizabeth continued, her tone growing sharper. "I challenge anyone here to prove that this book is not just a collection of myths from the 7th century. If no one can meet this challenge, I will burn it, right here, in front of all of you." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a match, raising it dramatically for all to see. Her eyes gleamed with self-satisfaction. Some gasped in disbelief. A few shouted in protest, but still, no one stepped forward. "See?" she smirked. "No one can defend this book. Religion is just an illusion. There is no God. And this Qur'an," she held the match higher, "cannot be saved from the fire of my logic." Just as she began to strike the match, a small voice broke through the tension-filled silence. "Wait." Heads turned. The sea of people parted slightly to reveal a tiny figure walking down the aisle. It was a young boy, only 5 years old, dressed simply, his face full of innocence but his eyes glowing with quiet determination. In his small hands, he clutched a miniature Qur'an, holding it protectively. Gasps filled the hall. No one could believe what they were seeing. A child was stepping forward to confront one of the most feared atheists in academia. Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "My name is Walid," the boy replied clearly. Then, raising his hand confidently, he added, "And I want to accept your challenge." A ripple of disbelief swept through the audience. Murmurs and whispers spread like wildfire. The idea that a mere child would dare to confront a professor of Elizabeth's stature seemed absurd. Elizabeth sneered. "You? A child wants to debate me?" She laughed mockingly. But Walid stood his ground unshaken. From the crowd, someone whispered, "This kid must be crazy. He doesn't know who he's dealing with." And yet, where he stood, Walid simply smiled. His gaze remained locked on the professor, unwavering and calm. For the first time, Elizabeth, so used to dominating every debate, felt a flicker of unease. There was something oddly compelling about this child. Something that made her hesitate. She stared at him, disbelief and irritation mixing on her face. The hand that was moments away from lighting the match now lowered slightly, fingers curling into a fist. She couldn't believe that a 5-year-old had not only interrupted her but dared to challenge her authority in front of thousands. The hall remained abuzz. All eyes were on Walid. "You want to argue with me?" Elizabeth repeated, this time with sharper emphasis. Walid nodded confidently. "I only wish to answer your question, if you'll allow me." Elizabeth smirked and crossed her arms. "Very well," she said mockingly. "Let's begin with something simple. If God exists, why can't we see him?" The room went silent again. Everyone waited for the boy's reply. Walid tilted his head slightly, as if in thought. Then he looked up at her and asked, "Mother, do you have a mind?" Elizabeth frowned. "Of course I do," she snapped. "But I can't see it," Walid said gently. "Does that mean your mind doesn't exist?" The crowd erupted. Gasps echoed through the room. Some students smiled in awe. Others chuckled, stunned by the sharpness of such a simple answer. Elizabeth stood frozen. She hadn't expected such a quick, clever response, especially not from a child. Trying to regain control of the situation, she fired back. Reason can be proven through our actions, through our thoughts and logic. Walid nodded slowly. Exactly. And so it is with God. Even if we cannot see Him directly. But we can see His creations, Walid continued. The sky, the earth, human beings, all are signs of His existence. He glanced around the room, then looked up at Elizabeth with calm conviction. You said reason exists because we can think. In the same way, God exists because we can see His signs. Elizabeth bit her lip. She had expected to easily crush any opposition, but this boy was different. She told herself it was nothing, a fluke. She just needed to ask more complex questions to expose his ignorance. All right, she said, her voice now more serious. If God is so loving, why does He allow suffering in the world? Why are people poor, hungry, and oppressed? Walid's lips curled into a soft smile. Then he asked, You're a professor, right? Of course, Elizabeth replied, clearly growing frustrated by how the boy answered every question with another question. Then surely you've given exams to your students? Elizabeth frowned, uncertain where he was going with this. Yes, of course. So tell me, Walid said, why do you give them tests? Don't tests make students stressed and unhappy? Wouldn't it be better to just give everyone high marks without making them suffer through exams? Elizabeth shook her head and replied quickly. Tests are necessary to measure their abilities. Without exams, how could I know who has truly learned and who hasn't? Walid nodded, then said gently, That's exactly why God tests us with hardships. Not because He doesn't love us, but because He wants to see who will be patient, who will strive, and who will stay faithful through their struggles. The professor was silent. Simple yet profound. The entire hall began to change in its energy. Those who had laughed at Walid before were now leaning forward, listening with admiration. The boy's answers were clear, thoughtful, and completely unexpected. Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to suppress the unease rising within her. All right, she said, a bit sharper now. Let's see how you handle this. If God is all-powerful, can He create a rock so heavy that He Himself cannot lift it? Walid let out a small chuckle, which only seemed to irritate her more. Mother, he said with childlike innocence, that's like asking if God can make a triangle with 4 sides. That's not a logical question. Elizabeth blinked in surprise. God creates everything according to His will, not according to the limits of human reasoning. He took a step forward, his small voice still carrying across the vast hall. If we try to measure God using our limited human logic, it's like an ant trying to understand how a human being thinks. It's impossible. The audience erupted. Applause began to spread. Some people were still trying to process the depth of what Walid had just said, but many were visibly moved. For the first time in her long career, Professor Elizabeth felt something she had never experienced during a debate: pressure. Not from a seasoned scholar or a peer, but from a child. Still, she refused to back down. Her voice now had a slight tremble. If God is real, then why doesn't everyone believe in Him? Walid's eyes sparkled as he replied, Do you believe that mathematics is true? Of course, she said. But not everyone understands math, right? Elizabeth's face froze. She realized too late that she had walked into a trap. Someone's lack of understanding, Walid said softly, doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist. People who don't believe in God, it's not because He isn't real, but because they haven't been guided, or they haven't been willing to reflect deeply. Elizabeth had no comeback. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides. Her face turned red, not just with anger, but with something deeper. Doubt. The auditorium had gone completely still, hanging on Walid's every word. The boy, once mocked and dismissed, now stood at the center of admiration and awe. His poise, his clarity, and his innocence were shifting the atmosphere in the room. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth felt fear, not fear of losing a debate, but the fear that perhaps she had been wrong all along. She had debated scholars, scientists, and theologians. But never had she felt this vulnerable. And certainly not because of a 5-year-old child. She glared at Walid, searching for a flaw, a mistake, anything she could latch onto to turn the debate back in her favor. With a slightly shaking voice, she pushed forward. "Then let's address something more fundamental," she said. "If Islam is the true religion, why does it have so many rules? Rules that restrict human freedom, like bans on alcohol, gambling, and other so-called prohibitions? Isn't freedom the right of every human being?" Walid looked at her gently, then asked, "Do you enjoy football?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, confused by the sudden shift. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Just answer, please," Walid said sweetly. She sighed. "I used to enjoy watching football. Not much these days." "Then you must know that football has rules, right? Offside, penalties, red cards?" "Of course," she replied. "So, do those rules make the game boring or bad?" Elizabeth paused, then shook her head. "No. The rules actually make the game more fair and organized." Walid smiled. "Exactly. The rules in Islam are the same. Allah gave us guidelines not to restrict us, but to protect us and keep us on the right path. Just like in football, if there were no rules, the game would descend into chaos. So too would life." Elizabeth pursed her lips. The logic was so simple, so direct, it was impossible to refute. But she wasn't ready to give up. "Not yet." "If that's the case," she said quickly, "why didn't God just create people without the desire to sin? Wouldn't it be easier if everyone was just born good and perfect?" Walid inhaled deeply, then answered with calm confidence. "Have you ever played chess?" Elizabeth was taken aback. "Another question?" "Yes," she said slowly. "I have." "Which is more fun?" Walid asked. "Playing against a person who makes their own moves, or playing against a robot that only follows a program?" Elizabeth's mouth fell slightly open. She knew what he meant. God gave humans the freedom to choose. Walid continued, his small voice carrying surprising clarity. "That's what makes life's tests meaningful. If people didn't have the ability to choose between good and bad, they wouldn't be human anymore. They'd be robots. But God wants us to choose the right path willingly, from our hearts, not because we're forced." The entire hall buzzed again. Heads nodded in admiration. Some students, who earlier dismissed the boy as nothing more than a child, now watched him with respect. Even some of the professors sat up straighter, intrigued. Elizabeth, however, felt increasingly cornered. She needed to regain control, to find a crack in the boy's logic. "All right," she said, raising her voice slightly. "If God is truly just, then why are some babies born with disabilities? Why are some people born rich and others poor? Isn't that unfair?" Walid smiled kindly. "Mother, do you know what a puzzle is?" Elizabeth furrowed her brow, caught off guard. "Of course I do. If we look at only one piece of the puzzle, we might not understand what it means," Walid said gently. "But when we look at the whole picture, we see how every piece plays a role in creating something beautiful." Elizabeth stood still, her breathing shallow. "God created every person with a purpose," Walid continued. "When we see someone born with a disability, we only see a piece of the puzzle. But God sees the whole picture. That child could be a source of strength for their family, or a lesson in compassion for others. Life isn't about winning or losing, it's about playing our role in the best way. Elizabeth gripped the edge of the podium tightly. Her usual arguments, ones that had once brought down entire panels of thinkers, were collapsing one by one. The mood in the room had shifted entirely. The students who had once laughed with her now sat in silent thought. A few lowered their heads, questioning their own long-held beliefs. Trying to stay composed, Elizabeth exhaled slowly and asked in a more measured tone, "But if God is real, why can't everyone see him? Why doesn't he just appear to everyone, so that no one doubts?" Walid smiled again. "Have you heard of radio waves?" "Of course," Elizabeth replied. "Well, we can't see them, can we?" he asked. "But we know they exist, because we can hear the sound through a radio if we have the right equipment." Elizabeth nodded silently. "God is the same," Walid said. "We can't see him with our eyes. But if we open our hearts and minds, we can feel his presence clearly. If someone closes their ears, they won't hear the music, not because the music isn't there, but because they've shut themselves off from it." Elizabeth was stunned. Each of her challenges had been met with thoughtful, sincere, and unshakable responses. And this time, she had no reply. Not because she lacked intelligence, but because the answers were undeniably logical. Simple yet powerful. Her hands began to tremble slightly. A cold sweat formed at her temple. For the first time in her entire career, she had no comeback. In silence, without uttering another word, she grabbed her bag, lowered her head, and slowly walked off the stage. Her steps were heavy, not from the shame of losing a debate, but because something inside her had started to break. A foundation she had once considered unshakable, her disbelief, now trembled. On the stage, Walid stood still, holding his small Qur'an to his chest. The hall that once cheered for Elizabeth now erupted into a standing ovation for the young boy. His courage, wisdom, and pure-hearted logic had moved the hearts of many. That day, at one of the world's most prestigious universities, a professor who had spent decades dismissing religion was silenced by the voice of a 5-year-old child. Elizabeth's footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. Her face was flushed, yes, from anger, but also from something deeper, shame. A renowned academic. A seasoned debater. Defeated by a child who had barely learned to read, but who held truth with a grip stronger than any textbook. Her mind reeled. Every answer the boy gave repeated in her head like a song she couldn't silence. Just as she neared the exit, a student's voice called out loudly, "Professor! Why are you leaving? Didn't you come here to debate? Now you're running away?" Elizabeth froze mid-step. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her heart raced. The entire hall turned their eyes toward her again. Would she return? Or had she truly given up? With visible effort, she turned around, her eyes sharp and her tone cold. "I'm not running," she said flatly. "I'm just done wasting time on nonsense." Back on stage, Walid smiled softly. Without sarcasm or arrogance, he said, "Then please continue your questions, Mother." There was no pride in his tone, only sincerity. Elizabeth returned to the stage, her expression tense. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she forced her voice steady. "All right," she said. "I'll ask something even more difficult. If God is so powerful, why does he allow evil people to live? Why doesn't he punish them immediately?" Walid blinked for a moment, then responded gently. "Have you ever read the story of Pharaoh?" Elizabeth narrowed her eyes. "Of course. But it's just a myth." Walid smiled kindly. "Pharaoh was a ruthless ruler," Walid said softly. "He oppressed his people and even claimed to be God. But God didn't punish him immediately. Why? Because God gives people time. Time to change. Time to repent. Time to show who they really are. Elizabeth didn't respond. The room was silent again. God could have punished Pharaoh in an instant. Walid continued. But then, where would be the justice for those who stayed patient? And what about those who still had a chance to turn back and choose the right path? He looked at Elizabeth with calm, unshaken eyes. Allah is the most just. He gives everyone time. But in the hereafter, not a single injustice will be left unaccounted for. The crowd in the lecture hall fell quiet once more. Students who once sat proudly in support of Elizabeth now looked down in thought. Some of them were starting to see Islam in a new light. Elizabeth clenched her teeth, refusing to give in. But what about natural disasters? She pressed. Earthquakes, tsunamis, diseases. If God is so loving, why would He let such things happen? Walid looked deeply into her eyes. Have you ever seen someone forge a sword? He asked gently. Elizabeth frowned. What does that have to do with anything? When someone wants to make a strong sword, Walid explained, they have to heat the iron in fire. Then they strike it again and again with a hammer. Only after that can it become sharp and strong. He paused for a moment. If the iron could speak, maybe it would cry out, "Why am I being burned? Why am I being beaten? Why this suffering?" But once the process is complete, that iron becomes something powerful, valuable. Elizabeth was silent, her breath caught in her chest. Human beings are like that, Walid said. Sometimes we must go through trials and pain. Not because God is cruel, but because through those hardships, we become stronger. We become more aware. We learn gratitude. We grow in understanding. Elizabeth couldn't respond. She was beginning to lose the ability to argue. Her logic, once razor-sharp, was unraveling. A lecturer sitting in the front row raised his hand. Professor Elizabeth, he said respectfully, I've followed your debates for years. But this time, this child hasn't just answered your questions, he's made us reflect in ways we never have before. Are you still sure of your beliefs? Elizabeth felt her throat go dry. She wanted to scream, to insist that it was all nonsense, that Islam was just a religion filled with rules, that God didn't exist. But no words came out. Another student stood up. Professor, he said, I used to admire you deeply. I was an atheist like you. But after hearing this child, I feel I need to rethink everything I believed. Elizabeth looked around the hall. The respectful gazes she once commanded were now filled with doubt. Those who once looked up to her now stared at her in silence. And amidst them all stood Walid, calm, humble, and still clutching his small Qur'an. The world around Elizabeth felt like it was spinning. For years she had believed God was nothing more than an illusion. Religion, foolishness. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt afraid. Not of losing a debate, but of the possibility that she had been wrong all along. Her hands trembled. Cold sweat trickled down her forehead. She couldn't speak anymore. Without saying a word, she grabbed her bag, lowered her head, and walked briskly toward the door. The room fell silent as she exited. Then, without warning, someone began to clap. Others followed. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted in thunderous applause. They weren't cheering because Elizabeth had lost. They were applauding the miracle of a 5-year-old boy who had made thousands rethink their views on God, truth, and life itself. Outside, the sky was gray, and the rain had started to fall. Professor Elizabeth walked alone down the long hallway of the university. Her coat was soaked. Her steps were slow. Her mind spun with confusion. I can't believe this, she thought. Decades of rejecting God, all the research, all the theories, Could they have all been wrong? Her chest felt tight. Not with anger, but with something much deeper. A question crept into her heart, a question she had avoided her entire life. What if God really does exist? Unknowingly, her steps led her to the quiet university garden. The rain grew heavier, but she didn't care. She sat down on a cold, wet wooden bench and stared up at the gray, endless sky. For the first time in her life, she felt small. All these years, she had believed herself to be the most rational, the most logical person in the room. But today, a child had shaken the very foundation of her intellect. Back inside the hall, Walid stepped down from the stage. Students swarmed around him, eager to speak, to ask more questions. But he felt a strange stillness inside him, like something unfinished. He glanced toward the exit where Elizabeth had disappeared. "What's wrong, Walid?" a lecturer asked gently. Walid clutched the Qur'an to his chest. "I need to see Professor Elizabeth," he said. The lecturer was surprised. "Why?" Walid looked up, his expression soft. "Because I want her to know that Allah always welcomes those who want to return." Without waiting, Walid walked out into the rain, letting it soak his clothes. He knew that tonight, he wasn't the only one searching for answers. Someone else needed them more. In the garden, Elizabeth still sat motionless, drenched, her thoughts spinning. Then, she heard soft footsteps approaching. She turned her head, and there stood Walid, holding his Qur'an tightly in both hands. Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes tired, her voice weak. "Why are you here?" Gone was the arrogance from earlier. Her voice held no superiority, only vulnerability. Walid stepped closer and smiled gently. "Because I want to give you this, Mother." He extended the small Qur'an toward her. Elizabeth stared at the book. Her hands trembled. "I don't believe in this," she whispered. Walid's smile didn't fade. "I didn't know anything either," he said softly. "But I read it, and I found the answers. Maybe you will too, if you're willing to read." Elizabeth stared into the child's clear, sincere eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never felt before. Peace. With trembling hands, she reached out and took the Qur'an. The rain still poured heavily. But in Elizabeth's heart, something had just begun to change.